welcome again to Marina Low to ACLU on the Hill. It's the third week of the session. How are you feeling?
Well, yeah, it feels like it should be the sixth week of the session, the way things are moving this year.
Relativistic speed. Well, tell us about a bill that actually had some movement and some good news this week that the ACLU supports.
Yeah, so we're working on a bill, HB 283, Workplace Discrimination Amendments, being sponsored by Representative Becky Edwards. This is a really important bill. Right now, workplace discrimination protection, so any sort of legal recourse for somebody who is discriminated against in the workplace, really only kick in if the employer has 15 employees or more. So that means if you happen to work for an employer that has 14 employees and you suffer discrimination in the workplace, there's nothing that you can do. There is no way that you can go into court and be made whole for the wrongs that you've suffered.
So you could be fired for just becoming pregnant, is that right?
Yeah, you could be fired because you're a woman, because you're black, because you're gay, any of these situations, and there's no recourse to be had against your employer for taking that adverse action. So what this bill would do would lower that employee threshold down to one employee. So long as an employer has a single employee, then they would be required to make sure that there's not discrimination taking place in the workplace.
Now, how is that bill doing? That sounds like a tough bill to lift here.
It is a tough bill to lift in a state like Utah, it's true. I do want to just point out, though, lots of other states have already taken this action. The federal anti-discrimination statute is set at 15, but a lot of states have recognized that that doesn't really make sense, and so by way of state statute have lowered that threshold down. So Utah would not be treading new ground in this area if we do pass this piece of legislation. But yes, it's definitely going to be somewhat of a heavy lift. We experienced our first real hurdle when the initial fiscal note came out. A fiscal note is sort of the accompanying information about a bill that speaks to the amount of money that it will cost to enact the legislation. And that information is provided by various agencies who might be tasked with putting the bill into effect. And the initial fiscal note that we got back on this bill was $1.9 million, which is a staggering price tag and ensures certain death for a bill that gets that sort of a price tag attached to it.
Now, how did you work to address that fiscal note? Are they flexible? Can you bring them down? How did you guys do that?
Well, it's important to remember that, like all pieces of the process in passing legislation, even the assignment of a fiscal note is, politics. And sometimes this piece in the process is used as a way to either kill a bill or support a bill. And so we worked with our sponsor. She really pushed back to the agencies to ask them how they came up with this number. One of the assumptions that was made initially was that this number was reached based on the very high percentage of small businesses that we have in Utah. And we had to sort of counter that argument by saying, that may be true, but the number you really need to focus on is the number of employees that are likely going to be impacted by this legislation. And because we're talking about small businesses, most of those businesses have very few employees. And so when we provided this information back to the fiscal analyst, we saw that number drop from $1.9 million down to $61,000.
Holy cow. Okay.
Yeah.
So that makes the bill much easier for the legislature to swallow.
We're off life support. We're able to conceive of this bill actually moving forward at this point.
And what is the next step for this bill?
So
HB 283.
So the bill will, it's currently in the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee sort of serves as a gatekeeper. They get to decide when a bill is going to move on to a committee, and they get to decide which bill it will be heard in. And so that's really the next step. We're waiting for its assignment. It will be heard in a committee, and that's really a great opportunity for people who care about this issue to come up to the Capitol, share your story if you've been discriminated against in the workplace, if you work for a small employer, and see this bill as an opportunity to be able to have the sort of protections we should have in the workplace. Come up and share that testimony so lawmakers understand that this is a real problem that does need to be fixed in our state.
Is this bill an example of building on previous legislation, previous efforts to reduce discrimination in Utah that have maybe affected specific topic areas like pregnancy or breastfeeding? But this bill affects everyone, right? This is all small employers, and it affects any range of discrimination.
That's right. So we're definitely not tinkering with the categories of people who could get protection from discrimination in the workplace. That's been done in the past, as you mentioned, whether it's women who are breastfeeding in the workplace, whether it's LGBT employees. Those protections have been added over the years. This really takes every single category and drops it down and makes it so that any employer with a single employee needs to do what they can to ensure that discrimination is not taking place in the workplace.
And when people are looking at jobs, they don't have to sort of check their rights if they decide to work for a small employer.
Right. If it's good for an employee with 16, an employer with 16 employees, it's probably also good for an employer with 14.
Well, thank you for giving us that update on HB 283. We'll follow that bill as it moves through, and
Great.
we'll put some information about how people can get in touch with us if they're interested in testifying and providing some stories to help push this bill across the finish line.
That would be great. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you. And tune in next week where we'll check back in with Marina Lowe on ACLU on the Hill.